slowly, please let me know if I'm going too quickly. It should help that I got in at about 2 in the morning, so I'm moving slowly in general. But please interrupt me if you need me to pause. So my presentation today is about information laundering. What is information laundering? It's the process of moving a piece of information, often false or misleading information, from a less credible to a more credible source. I first wrote about this phenomenon back in 2018 when I co-authored a report with a Ukrainian colleague who actually works in anti-money laundering sanctions. And what he noticed is that there are significant parallels between running a disinformation campaign and running a money laundering operation. Mainly, in both cases, you have people who have a dirty product. In one case, information. In one case, illegitimate money. And they need to move that product from its illegitimate point of origin to a legitimate destination. So think of a drug dealer. Very easy to make money. What's hard is to get that money into a legitimate financial institution. You can't just walk in with a bag of $10 million in cash to a Bank of America. There are going to be questions. Similarly, if you're running a disinformation campaign, if you're a foreign intelligence agent, for example, you can't just walk into the BBC with an article or hack emails and expect them to publish that. So there's a process. So in the case of a money launderer, they first need to place the dirty money into a clean point of origin. So a shell account, shelf account, a fake business. Still though, they can't just put large amounts of money into a new business and then move that money to a bank. So there's a process called layering. This is often called smurfing. So it's making a bunch of small little transactions from many different accounts so that when it reaches the bank, it doesn't appear to be suspicious. So similarly, if you're trying to run a disinformation campaign, you need to place that information online. This is very easy in the digital environment. You can put it on a blog, you can set up a social media account, you can put it in the comments section of an article, and then you get a bunch of other social media accounts and other blogs to cite that content and to start moving it around. At a certain point, real people will pick up on these narratives, and they'll run articles on them. And so you then have hundreds of Twitter accounts, blog posts, semi-credible outlets, all talking about the same thing. And then finally, there'll be a point of integration where a major media outlet will cover the story. Sometimes even to debunk the story, but they're still talking about the story. And so when most people see a piece of information, they're seeing it from a source that is not the original source. So why is that a problem? I know there's a lot of people in here who work on media literacy. And one of the cardinal rules of media literacy is you have to know the source. You have to understand the source's biases, whether or not it's a credible source, if it's a state-backed information outlet, who the state is behind it. Information laundering obfuscates that whole process. It's hard to understand who patient zero is, the original source, the original person essentially who's infected with the virus, in this case, who's putting the virus into the world. Just to give a little history on this, and Martin laid this out already, this all has its origins in Soviet disinformation. The classic case is called Operation Infection. In the 1980s, Soviet intelligence agents created a myth that the US government had created AIDS as a biological weapon to infect the third world, developing countries. They first placed this narrative in an Indian newspaper called The Patriot. From there, it bounced around media outlets around the world. These are sort of the early memes in some cases. These were pamphlets that were passed out in Africa. And then eventually, it made its way to the CBS Evening News in America, Dan Rather, one of the most credible, respectable news organizations or news programs at the time. That process, though, took about 7 years, from originally placing the story to getting it into a legitimate outlet. Now this process is lightning fast. This is a case we tracked a few years ago, very similar narrative, that the US government was running a biological weapons program out of the Luger lab in Georgia. First appeared in a Bulgarian blog post. The next day, Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts on Reddit started talking about this. 2 days later, Russian state media covered it. Russian government officials talked about it. And a week later, it was on Fox News, Deutsche Welle. Again, they were debunking the story, but it was still being talked about, so it's placed into people's minds. So this is what the digital ecosystem makes very easy now. And just a final case study to walk you through how the digital environment makes this so easy to do and so hard for us to combat. So we saw this story appear on RT.com back in January. It was an article about classified documents being found in US President Joe Biden's house. Edward Snowden made a comment on it. So we wanted to see who else was running this story. So I ran it through Google News and a Bing search. And we found many other outlets running what appeared to be the same exact story. First two from an organization called the Big News Network. They run about 500 sort of faux local blogs around the world. Appear to be local news outlets in the US, regional outlets, whatever. But there was also an article that was published in what's called Little Rock AR News. Little Rock is the capital of Arkansas in the US. We'd never seen this blog before, so we did some investigation. Same exact story, but in this case, you had an author who appears to be an American named Judy Allen. Judy Allen had published 550 articles that day. I know there are many journalists here. That's a good day for a journalist. This person doesn't exist. Not only is the name not real, the image is not real. It's AI generated. So what we noticed, though, is that certain words in the article were being changed. And they do this to avoid plagiarism detection in Google search, and Bing search. So once we saw the pattern of how they were changing words, we searched again. And we found basically the same article in Albuquerque Breaking News. Albuquerque is a city in New Mexico in the US. You see basically the same story, but a different author also doesn't exist. And then we did a little digging, found that both of these blogs were registered to a DDoS service provider in Iceland. This protection company probably services many blogs, but it was an indicator that this was being run by the same person or the same entity. And once we had those clues, we could do a little digging to try to find more fake local news sites. And what we found is that these guys were good at covering the tracks, but they got a little bit sloppy, and they didn't change the Our Team section. So the Our Team section was the same, and once we figured that out, we found that they were running 150 fake local news sites, often repackaging RT content, content from Xinhua, from Chinese state media, as if it were authentic local news content. Very similar situation a few weeks ago. One of my analysts noticed that RT, which of course is blocked on YouTube right now, was able to set up essentially shell accounts for its Spanish language outlets by rebranding itself as Sepa Mas. So you see, exact same title, but the logo was just covered up in one. Occasionally, they weren't smart enough to not have their reporters use an RT microphone, which gave it away. But again, this is how easy it is to mask the point of origin of information, to clean it, to launder it into a more credible outlet. So finally, just to wrap up, and I usually want to wrap up on a more positive note. This is not going to be a positive note. As Martin already outlined, we are now facing this sort of AI ChatGPT generation of disinformation. So the example I gave, this is from 4 months ago, of us being able to track specific words that were being replaced. That process is now probably obsolete. So I just ran the RT article through ChatGPT and said, give me 4 different headlines. It gives me 4 perfect headlines in English, entirely recreated, which will make it impossible for us to understand the sort of copy-paste sites that we're trying to track. So that's the challenge we now face. And I'll stop there and wait for your questions. Thank you.